Hello, everyone. Thank you for tuning in to another episode of the Believe in Brits podcast. It is the end of April, which can mean only one thing, and that is talking about all things draft. Despite not having a first round draft pick, we will still talk all things Cleveland Browns with these draft picks. So let's get at it. You're listening to the Believe in Brits podcast. Yep. So thank you to Shaun and Owain, not only for jumping on this one on what is a very late hour here on a Tuesday night, but also for taking the draft preview show. I was off. I think that one was in Holland, and then for the draft I was in York. So doing a bit of catch up myself. So the pod will be a good exercise for me. But first, let's go to our draft aficionado, shall we? Owain, I'm assuming that you stayed up for pretty much. Definitely not you, mate. I appreciate the little wave, Shaun, but I think that I think you're as far from it as physically possible with what you've come out with when it comes to college ball. You put it on pretty much the same level as basketball, pretty much. Owain, mate. I'm assuming that you stayed up for pretty much all of it. Being the way that you are.
I did. I must admit, as I'm getting into older age, it's becoming more difficult, I think, to stay up every year. They sort of done, I think it was about 30 picks in the first round. Must admit, I think I missed our our third round pick.
I don't think I'd blame you for that.
Yeah, because the second round pick didn't thrill me, so I was in a bit of a bad mood and I was tired, and I was like, "Oh fuck this! I'm just going to go to sleep." Excuse my language, but
we'll put the explicit tag on this one. Don't worry.
But yeah, I call probably 95% of it. I think day 3 is always quite hard to follow because obviously the draft coverage sort of goes off after a while, so you have to try and find alternate ways to sort of follow along. So tried a few different things on day 3, but yeah, long 3 days, but yeah, good fun as always.
Yeah, I think I've only followed it all the way through when it was in Cleveland. I think that's just because they did all sorts of the extra shots. Because you're talking obviously about, the extra shots not being very pick related. I think that's the only time I actually stayed engaged was when it was obviously talking about Cleveland and all the rest of it. So that was quite fun. Shaun, on a scale of me to Owain, so I saw literally maybe the first overall pick, and the rest I caught from mainly the full 10 yards chat for the first night, and then all the way up to Owain, who saw everything apart from maybe 3 or 4 picks. Where do you fall on that scale? How much did you consume?
I saw picks 153 to 155. And the reason that is extremely random is
Villa you didn't see 156. You didn't see the Browns pick at 156.
Well, the reason I didn't see it, which is what I was coming to, is typically Sky Sports decided to go for a commercial break during our pick. So that was enough for me. I turned it off at that point. I didn't watch any of it, mate, to be fair. We kind of jokingly said, myself and Owain last week, it'd probably be a long 3 days, and I think you've got to be quite the draft aficionado, particularly when you haven't got a first round pick, because even if you don't watch college, obviously all the mock drafts are around the first round and you can kind of get on board and get excited, and it's really difficult. You read all these articles pre-draft and the Browns just aren't even mentioned, and we sort of said last week, it's so difficult to even start to begin to think what might the pick be at 54, because obviously there's just so many variables between the draft start and obviously getting to that stage. So, yeah, it wasn't a draft I was particularly excited about, but I also think that's a good thing. We've gone from the draft being a Super Bowl that we need to find 5 or 6 key contributors and potentially starters to we're now looking at, can some of these guys even make the roster, which is exactly where you want to be. So it shows how far we've come. But as we said last week, I'm sure we'll all be in agreement. It'd be nice to be back in the first round next year. Even if it's just a trade out of it, it'll be nice to be in the conversation.
Yeah. It was nice to read an Athletic article. I think it was a couple of days back that said the Cleveland Browns can finally say they have a first round draft pick next year.
Yeah,
And
exactly.
we'll get onto that in a bit as well, because I think that we do need to address as to what has happened with that capital as well, and sort of look at that in a bit more depth, because I don't know how much we'll be able to talk about this one. Owain, you're carrying the team, buddy. You're carrying the team for us, but there'll be some things which I think that we can say. So let's go through the Browns picks. But we'll do them as a lineup first of all. So pick 54, Michael Hall Jr., who is a defensive tackle from Ohio State. Then going to the other side of the river, with pick 85, Zach Zinter, the offensive guard from Michigan. I believe that that Hall Jr. broke Zinter's leg, did he not, in in the big game between Ohio State and Michigan last year, which will create for quite an interesting backstory as we head to OTAs. Jamari Thrash, a wide receiver from Louisville, with pick 156. That's the one that Sky Sports decided to gloss over. The question is it merciful or not? Time will obviously tell. Pick 206, Nathaniel Watson, linebacker from Mississippi State. And then pick 227, Miles Harden, a corner from South Dakota. So, Owain, I come to you first, just because you've, not because we're hyping you up as the draft man, but because you've already started your critique here. Now, you've said that you were uninfused, I think was your wording, with our first selection, Michael Hall Jr. Explain.
Right, I'm going to preface this by saying that Ohio State are probably one of the hardest teams to actually watch when you're over here in the UK.
Yes.
One, because they're barely ever on TV. I don't know
Yep.
whether that's a rights issue or whatever, but they're hardly ever on TV. And actually,
Big
the
Ten is
fact
tough
that
to find. Yeah.
the games are on really late as well.
Yeah.
The Ohio State games are always on stupidly late over here. So I haven't seen a ton of Michael Hall play. The thing that I was sort of unimpressed by was positional value. I think me and Shaun spoke about it the other day. We sort of, I said that I would had a real hard time seeing us draft a defensive tackle at 54. Purely because obviously last year, me and Shaun joked about it. Shaun mentioned that Siaki Ika was drafted in the 6th round of the draft the year previously, which it sort of felt like, but he was obviously a top 100 pick for the Browns just a year ago. So I thought with the way that they'd sort of patched that position over in the last couple of years was on the whole pretty good. And I thought with Ika having sort of a red shirt season last year, that they probably had enough to go into this year and look forward as well. Obviously, Michael Hall's a different player than Siaki Ika. Siaki Ika is going to be someone that's just sort of plugging gaps in the run game. And Michael Hall has been drafted with the intention that he's going to be, a pass rush specialist and really be able to rush the passer a lot better. Barry said that himself multiple times in the sort of post-draft interviews. But it just all goes back to positional value for me. A couple of things worry me about the pick. One of them is that the Browns under Andrew Berry haven't identified defensive tackle very well, I think it's fair to say. You look back at, they've pretty much taken one every draft, or if not, they have done every draft. You look, I think Andrew Berry's first draft featured Jordan Elliott, which, at the time, you look at the sort of the summaries from draft experts and draft analysts. You look at Jordan Elliott's draft summary and you look at Michael Hall's draft summary, and they're both really similar. Really good pass rush win rates in college, good PFF numbers in college when it comes to rushing a passer. Both, I hate when people comp these players to Hall of Famers, but both getting the nickname of Baby Aaron Donald or whatever the case may be. So he was year 1, Tommy Togi was year 2, Siaki Ika year 3, or maybe I'm off a little bit on the years there, but I think it's fair to say there's concern about the way they've evaluated this position in the past. Not to say that Michael Hall's going to be a bust or not going to be, able to contribute, but that would be the main worry that I have about the pick of 54.
Yeah, so I'm literally just looking through every pick that Andrew Berry has ever made, and if you type it into Google for anyone that's listening along, just Andrew Berry draft picks, you find one from Browns Wire. They've done it, and yeah, you look at the defensive tackle position, and it is one of which has the most glaring. Anything to do with defensive line is quite glaring in terms of his picks. You got Perry and Winfrey in there as well, of which,
As well,
yeah, that's another one of which just adds to that list of despair, really. And you look at it, wide receiver wasn't exactly is another one where he's not exactly done well either. Yeah, the more you look at it, the more you think that there's only a few really that are hit. But I guess that's sort of also a thing as to whether or not the Browns take the draft. Whether or not the Browns are looking at the draft in the same way that others are, or the way that we may have looked at it in years gone by. A point of which Shaun makes, Shaun, which you made earlier, in terms of you're looking for people to fill, not necessarily fill gaps to start, but those that can grow into players, and mining one or two out of a field of essentially crops. You're trying to harvest a couple of good eggs.
Yeah, listen, I think correct me if I'm wrong, and I don't want to put words into anybody's mouth here. I think the selection is probably underwhelming because it's not one of those positions that instantly jumps off the board unless he becomes an Aaron Donald type. Because even the real good ones in the league don't necessarily get mentioned an awful lot. It's one of those positions that isn't a particularly glamorous position, is it? Defensive tackle. With that said, I kind of threw him out there at the back end of the pod last week because I thought age profile, one of the younger guys in the draft class, there's somebody there to build around. He's obviously got time on his side. There's not a huge commitment in the room, as we kind of discussed, outside of Dalvin Tomlinson. It's been pretty much sort of 1 year rentals. And as you say, we've took some swings in the draft and nothing's necessarily panned out. I also think probably more so than ever this year that the board has probably almost dictated to some extent what they needed to do. Because if you look at the way that the draft panned out, we talked about this last week, didn't we, mate? That it was very, very offensive heavy. So much so to the tune that actually in the first round, 23 players were selected on offense, which is by far the most that there has been in terms of a lopsidedness for, going back. I've gone back through the last 4 years and it's by far the biggest discrepancy. And I wouldn't be surprised if it's the biggest one ever. It was a huge discrepancy towards offensive talent. 8 tackles, 7 wide receivers. So already once you get to the second round, in years gone by, you might have been taking the 4th or 5th best receiver or best tackle. You were down to 9th best, 10th best on people's draft boards potentially. And when I look at the defensive tackle position, the way that went, 1 took in the first round, and then there was 7 in the second round. But the last one in the second round was Michael Hall. 6 had actually come off the board in that round before we came to pick 54. And there wasn't another one taken until pick 95. So I understand potentially from a positional value point of view, but if you were looking at the sort of draft board and you potentially got 2 or 3 names on there, we've kind of sort of stood pat in terms of where the picks are. And Berry almost sort of gave that away in his pre-draft presser that probably don't expect an awful lot of movement up or down the board. It's probably the first time ever that that's been the case. We've kind of just sat where we were. And I think the way that sort of board panned out, it was like, well, Michael Hall's probably got a second round grade on him in terms of what the Browns board was. And then the next defensive tackle was probably way, way down the list. So I just think it probably almost forced the hand a little bit with the way that the board fell to him at that position and at that point. But like I say, I'm not trying to put words into anybody's mouth, but I think ultimately we could have picked the first defensive tackle on the board and people wouldn't have been overly excited because it's one of those positions, isn't it?
Yeah, no, there's definitely something to be said for that. And yeah, because of, I think because obviously you can't really go deep diving on it. And, I mean, I watched some Ohio State games. I can't exactly say that I was necessarily looking at the lines and looking at those as potential Browns players, so I couldn't really tell you a lot about that. You kind of just look at tape and that sort of thing afterwards, and sort of looking more after the pick has come in, as to trying to find whatever videos, research, etc. And there's not a lot to say about him really. So I think that's kind of something which is sort of not necessarily tarnished the reaction, but more of a case of you're definitely dictated by what other people are saying, of which obviously.
Just out of interest, Owain, at 54, then the board's obviously played out the way that it's played out. Who would you have been interested in at 54 at that stage? Who was on there? Because I know we talked a lot about wide receiver and as a position that you might look at in terms of real value. We obviously talked about tackle. Just looking at the pick sort of in and around it that were at that position. The next pick off the board was an offensive tackle. Patrick Paul went to the Dolphins. Blake Fisher went not too many picks thereafter. I'm just looking in terms of wide receivers. One went 2 picks before in Adonai Mitchell. Next one was Malachi Corley at the start of the 3rd round. So not necessarily any of those guys, mate, just because they were in the vicinity. But was there anybody on the board in particular that you really fancied? I know Amadeji was still on the board. He was one that you talked about initially.
Yeah, so he would have been one of them. Patrick Paul, I think, would have interested a few, but he was quite a bit on the older side. I think he was going to be like almost 24 come first week of the season. So
guardrails wouldn't have allowed that.
Yeah, in the 2nd round, that's never likely to be a Browns pick. You mentioned it there at wide receiver. I was really disappointed when Adonai Mitchell went off the board 2 picks before. You never know whether the Browns try to trade up or whatever, or whether they even had any interest in him in the first place. But he would have been the one that I would have been super keen on. Talked about as a mid-first rounder, sort of the whole draft cycle, or mid to late first rounder, the whole draft cycle. And obviously the week of the draft, the whole diabetes thing comes out and caused a slide there with people concerned about how he's handled that and character concerns. But we mentioned him on the pod last week. And for me, even though, I can wholly understand the argument that a wide receiver being drafted in the 2nd round, you're not likely to see him take many snaps or make a good contribution until next season. But I just think if you've got a chance at an ex wide receiver that can be a real difference maker long term, it's worth that sort of capital. So I was disappointed when he went off the board the pick before. But I think going back to like the D tackle and taking a D tackle, I think you look at next year and you look at the holes that they're going to have next year, and you kind of get a little bit worried whether they're going to be able to fill the biggest holes on that offense in one draft. And you look at it as well, they may have to come in and really like play quickly next year as well. Obviously, you look at wide receiver, you've only got Jerry Jeudy under contract next year out of the bigger 3 names. You'd expect Cooper maybe to get done, but at the same time, like, I don't know what you two think, but I just think they extend Cooper by like 3 years now, which is probably something he's going to want realistically after the season he just put up. In those 3 years, do you think you get caught a little? There's a chance for me that you get
I don't
caught
reckon they do it.
hitting the wall.
I mean,
know.
there's constant talk, that Cooper is, an obvious cut candidate. Of which
I don't think he's going to get. He's obviously not going to get cut in the next season.
Well, not cut for Nick, but as in that, they'll just let the contract run.
And to be honest, it would make sense to me.
Yeah,
because
and I don't see how that changes unless there's no way that you can see yourself land another WR1/2. I think that the reason why they brought Jerry Judy in and they've extended him is to be able to, ride that risk potentially as well. See that potential and see if he can, take at least own the two.
Yeah,
But even if they do, sorry, Sean, even if they do extend him, you've got 2 wide receivers there. You're going to have to play 3 wide. Realistically, you're starting 3 wide receivers anyway. For the most part. So you're obviously 1 down there unless Tillman, takes a big leap in year 2. I don't think Bell has got the potential to be a top 3 wide receiver in the NFL. Just like he's limited from a physical standpoint. We've said that all along. And then obviously offensive tackle, they've put themselves in a sticky situation now where they have to make a decision on Jedrick Wills or Jack Conklin long term, or start a rookie tackle next year. There's no kind of in between there, because chances of them finding a left tackle on the open market next year are incredibly slim. And even if they do, you're going to be overpaying by quite a bit to land someone who's probably just above average, you would say. So they've put themselves in a little sticky situation where they're going to have to get someone in next year, left tackle, or pay Jed.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things from that. I think the longer Deshaun Watson doesn't get restructured this year, it almost feels to me like they're creating an opportunity to get out of Dodge next year. It's going to cost, but I think they're almost at the point of saying, well, enough's enough, because we're being hamstrung by this if it doesn't work out. The fact that they still haven't done it, to me, he's quite alarming. I think in terms of the wide receiver conversation, won't repeat everything we said post the trade happening, but that's why I was disappointed with giving Judy the contract when they did, because I think you could have just played this year and then extended either Cooper or Judy once you knew what you got in Judy. They banked on the fact that he will be good. The reality is now, if he's not, well, tough shit, we've got him for the next 3 years. So that's the end of that conversation. That's why I would have held off personally on that. I suppose just in terms of moving this on, though, mate, and again, come back to your expertise at receiver. Thrash isn't one that was mentioned last week, so we were talking more around the sort of 54 and 85 range, and he's obviously come off the board much later on. Again, my knowledge extremely limited. Everything I read, though, suggests that potentially he's probably the best of the bunch in terms of the others that you've mentioned there, the likes of Tillman, Bell, some of the others that took a bit of a swing at a later time. There seems to be a lot of positivity around Thrash in terms of what he might be. I don't think anyone suggested he's going to become a number 1 receiver and he's going to, be putting up 1,400 yards a season. But it certainly sounds positive in as much as he could well make a telling contribution and be a key part of an offense in the future.
Yeah, I think it's interesting when it comes to Jamari Thrash. I think, there's a podcast that I listen to on a regular basis. I've been listening to it for a couple of seasons, and they go through the scouting process for a full year and come to their conclusions by the end of the year. PFF Stock Exchange, so you've got a couple of really good draft analysts on there, and Connor Rogers is one of them. Really good follow on Twitter. He's been high on him all year. Out of the like you said, the next tier of wide receivers, he's been really high on him. He ended up with a third round grade on Jamari Thrash, which is obviously good value considering we got him
value considering 5th.
Yeah. Steve Smith as well. If you go on YouTube, he's done a deep dive into pretty much every receiver in the draft this year, and he's high on Jamari Thrash. I think when you look at it, I think it's interesting because skill set wise, you probably look at his skill set and think, okay, this guy's going to be really effective out of the slot. Then you look at it like the snap alignment and stuff like that. He's played 90% of his snaps out wide, which is quite interesting. Slender build, I would say. I think he's like 6'1", but he's thin.
He looks very slender. Yeah. I'm looking at pictures of him right now. He's almost cornerback sort of build.
Yeah, he's thin, and that would obviously again lend itself to you thinking this guy's going to be a slot, because against press man, any sort of press coverage where the DB is going to get their hands on him, he may find that difficult because of lack of play strength. But what he has got, I don't know, he's smooth, he's fluid, and like the speed he is, I think he ran like 4.4, 4.46, something like that. He's no slouch by any means, but he is very, very fluid in the way he moves, which when he is on the outside, it makes like comeback routes, hitches, stuff like that look in really, really impressive, and he gets a lot of separation on those type of routes. I
And
don't
that's
think he's
probably
ever
the
gonna...
kind of passing player we're looking to get to now. Looking at players that can stretch field.
Yeah, well, that's the thing I was going to get on to. I don't think he is going to be that type of player that takes a top off a defense. I think when you look at, like, especially when he was at Louisville, the sort of routes that he would win on, and Steve Smith kind of says in that breakdown that they sort of hampered him a little bit by the routes that they allowed him to run. But the ones that he was winning on was like curls, 10-yard, 15-yard curls, hitches, over routes. So nothing like that was gonna... He weren't running a load of like 9 routes and winning, with deep balls all the time. But in like the short to intermediate range, he was really, really effective. So again, get him free releases in the slot, and he may be really effective in that type of thing. What me and Shaun spoke about on the pod the other day when it came to wide receiver was we lost Goodwin last year, which was meant to be the real field stretcher. They tried with Schwartz before Goodwin to get that type of skill set.
Yeah.
They still haven't really got it for me. I don't think Thrash is going to come in and be that player. Judy's pretty effective, actually, quite, surprisingly, because you don't look at him as some sort of burner, but he is actually quite fast and he is good in that area of the field. But you still think they may be missing that player that can just really, really scare teams. Like, you look at Kansas City and what they build in there post Tyreek Hill. They've now got 2 players that can run a 4-2. I know it doesn't really mean jack shit, but they have got those players that are going to really scare teams. And you wonder whether the Browns are going to miss out on that. But that said, the NFL and defenses in the NFL are sort of switching to defenses that say, right, we're going to take those deep shots away. You're not going to beat us with one play. You're going to have to dink and dunk all the way down the field. And they've been transitioning to that over the last year or two. And you do wonder whether that's going to play into the Browns' lap sort of thing with, 3 or 4 wide receivers now that are really, really good route runners in that short to intermediate range. You look at Cooper, Moore, Judy, Thrash. They can all work in that sort of range really effectively. And you can even throw David Bell in there as well, because to give him his credit, that's where he's going to win as well. He's not going to beat you deep ever, but that's where he's going to win if he is going to win as well. So maybe they're identifying trends to see where the NFL passing game is going to go, and they're really pushing all the chips into that sort of basket.
Yeah, interesting. I mean that would be great. And definitely, I think you've been harping on about getting a good wide receiver for a while. For
and I'll be doing
2
the same
years that we've been running.
I'd imagine.
Exactly. Yeah, you will not stop until you get a first round wide receiver, and even then it won't be enough. The other pick of which I think that we should get onto a little bit, just because I actually think that this was probably the smartest pick that we had, and that was Zach Zinter, the guard from Michigan, because I think that before the injury, and I remember doing some. I think I was doing it for 10 yards. I was just looking at some draft analysis back in December. Zinter was quite high for those that needed a guard. And then the injury sort of tanked his value. He's not been able to show himself really on the circuit or anything in the leads up to it. So you're wondering as to whether or not it's a true 3rd round pick at that point, whether it's more injury risk versus reward. I watched 3 Michigan games, I think, last year. I did think that the Lions held up well. As to how much of that was Zinter, I couldn't exactly tell you. I'm no offensive line expert, unfortunately, but it's something of which gives me a little bit of, that's where I think I saw the value from the Browns in this draft. Don't know what you guys make of it.
Yeah, I mean, again, I'm not going to comment too much on what he has or hasn't done in terms of on the field, but certainly, again, in terms of pedigree, in terms of the fact that he's been unanimously voted an All-American during his time in college. Like you say, again, it was a position we kind of thought they might go more tackle than guard, but we obviously stressed the importance of looking to the future with the O-line, and obviously that was the first sort of pick towards doing that. Again, I think it's a sensible selection. He's not going to be rushed and pushed to sort of come in and start straight away. But we saw last year, Bitonio's not getting any younger. A few injury concerns have started to creep in there. So I think ultimately, the day he's coming that we've got to look for the heir apparent at that position. Hopefully he can be that. As you say, I think without the leg break, he certainly would have been much higher. It seems, like you say, again, from what I can sort of, decipher from all the coverage and everything. So was pretty happy with the selection. Again, it's one of those, like we said earlier about defensive tackle. It's not good. No one's going to have woke up and gone, yay, we've got a guard, because that's just not what anybody wants, is it? But fundamentally, football, as we all know, boring as it is won in the trenches on both sides of the ball. And if you can get the trenches right, you can kind of make up for the fact that you haven't got the elite guys in the skill positions. You obviously want the combination of both, but fundamentally, if the quarterback's on his arse before he's had time to assess the field, it doesn't matter who you've got at wide receiver, does it? So, sensible pick, certainly one for the future. Kind of that funny coincidence, like you say, that pick 1 broke pick 2's leg, or pick 2 broke pick 3's leg, whichever way you want to look at it. But they seemed to quite laugh it off when they were together at the press conference the other day as well, didn't they?
Yes, apparently they are brothers now, I think was the quote.
But no, big dude as well. He's 6'6". He's like I say, he's the prototypical lineman body. So, fingers crossed, mate. Again, like I say, I've got limited knowledge in terms of what he's like. Owain probably will be able to fill in a few of the blanks there. Now he shake his head. He's not a wide receiver, so even Owain doesn't know, does he?
Well, I tell you what. Here's something that I can add to it. Apparently, he published a illustrated children's book at the start of this year around offensive line play and Michigan traditions. So if it doesn't work out for him, if football doesn't work out for him, he's got children's books to fall back on. So the weird things you find on clevelandbrowns.com. Yeah, author of a children's book in the top 5 things. But the jewel of that, it being the fact that he was part of 2 Joe Moore award-winning offensive lines in 21 and 22. So promise at the very least, and definitely one to look out for the future. So I'm not going to take us down the further route. I think that, as we start getting towards 6th and 7th rounders, it starts to all just get a little blurred, and it's more guesswork than anything, unless Owain has anything which he really wants to labour on.
Not really. I think that the only other pick that I'd mention anything on would be the corner. I'm blanking even on his name. But the only... Sorry?
Miles Harden, was it?
Yeah, Miles Harden. That's it. The only reason I'd mention his name is because apparently he was supposed to have had a really, really good game against Luther Burden last season. Luther Burden is going to be one of the top wide receivers that come out next year from Missouri. At the minute, he's consensus 6. I know it doesn't mean a great deal at this point in the season, but he's consensus 6th pick in the draft next year, and by all accounts, he's the top wide receiver going into next season. So something to maybe keep an eye on, whether he manages to get into the bottom of that cornerback room in the summer.
it's great that all these guys they were talking like this, isn't it? And without repeating what I said, it's a bit like the other one that I'll just quickly mention. Nathaniel Watson felt like a very typical A/B selection. Stats off the board, defensive tackling machine on the defensive side of the ball. I think he led the SEC last year in tackles, SEC Defensive Player of the Year. Plenty of off the field concerns. Where does that sound familiar? All right, so again, it could be a real swing and a miss, but also if he can get his head screwed on, if he can get his act together, potentially that's a tacky type replacement. They'll be looking for somebody in that room. I think let's be honest, if you looked at it now, you're locking in JOK, you're locking in Hicks. I think that linebacker room is very much open to debate thereafter. So I think if Nathaniel Watson can put a strong pre-season and camp together, he might be one of the ones that was drafted slightly later on that's got a chance of making the 53 this year, and straight on the 53, not on the practice squad or anything like that.
Fantastic. Right, let's draw a line under the 2024 draft for the Browns. Obviously, we'll cover more of that off as we go through the summer and into preseason. You'll be glad to know, gentlemen, 2025 NFL draft. We own our own picks in rounds 1, 2, 3, 4, and 6. And we also have 2 other 6th round picks from Minnesota and Detroit, and a 7th from Minnesota. So,
and 2 comp picks in the 7th as well.
And 2 comp picks as
unless they go out and do something. No.
Yes, as I've been rightly called on there, 2 extra picks as well. So the next year's pod, when we talk about the draft, will actually be quite different. This has been sort of like cloak, daggers, and all sorts. This should be like, even if he trades them all away, we'd still have more content. So, but let's touch on a shadier topic for a second. So obviously the reasons to why we lost so much draft capital is because of the Watson trade and losing out on those 1st round picks and 4th round pick and 3rd round picks as we go through. Do you want to hear what the eventual fallout was? Of course you do. Of course you do. So this is what Houston got for the trade. I'm not going to go through all the traded to. I'm just going to give you what they got. Kenyon Green, the guard. Damian Pierce, the running back. Will Anderson Jr., the edge. Tank Dell, the wide receiver. Kamari Lassiter at corner. Jamal Hill at linebacker. Caden Bullock at safety. And Cade Stover at tight end. But if the Browns had just kept the picks and drafted who was drafted at those positions, would have been Jordan Davis at defensive tackle, Damian Pierce, Jamar Gibbs, Jalen Hyatt, Brian Thomas Jr., and Cade Stover at tight end. So realistically, looking at those and seeing as to what we got in return, it does sort of make you look and go, well, the draft is the draft can find some gems, but there's also some risk involved. But we've also taken on a hell of a lot of risk. I think that's probably fair to say.
Yeah, but I think fundamentally, everybody likes to say who's won this trade, who's lost this trade. If you're judging it today, there's only one winner in it, and that's the Houston Texans.
Absolutely.
If Deshaun Watson starts to perform the way that the Browns hope that he will, and he's shown glimpses that he might, ask this question again in 12 months, 2 years' time, and if the Cleveland Browns have got to a Super Bowl, or fingers crossed, touch wood, have won a Super Bowl, they did the trade a million times over. So
yeah,
fundamentally, it's got to be viewed in the long term. Obviously, in the short term, there's a lot of pain attached to it. And obviously, it's not just the on-field; it's the off-field. Let's not regurgitate it all again. I think we'd all be
no, of course not. No, this was definitely more of a drawing a line under
and
episode.
And fingers crossed, like I say, that's it now. Like I say, fundamentally, we'll look back at it as a success or not, depending on how the next 2 or 3 years go. And obviously, like I say, if it's been successful, they'd do it a million times over, whether we as fans liked it or not the first time round. They'd still do it again if it brought success on the field.
Oh, exactly. And I think also that if the Browns had made those picks, especially when you look at Andrew Berry's record, and I'm looking through some of the picks now, and I'm kind of shaking my head a little bit, and I'm looking at what the exact picks would have brought. I'm looking at it, and I'm thinking, I don't think we'd have got that kind of holdback.
Yeah, but if you look at the Texans one, that's not amazing either. Like the first two picks was what, Kenyon Green, Damian Pierce.
Oh, there's been a
Neither,
lot of trading back and like they've got additional picks back and all the rest of it as well.
yeah,
But
but
I'm looking more at the exact ones.
yeah, you
There
look
are
you
a
look at
lot.
those
There are a
two.
lot of hits in that one.
So those first two would have been in year 2 last year.
Mhm.
Yeah, year 2 last year. Neither of them were starters.
Yeah.
Damian Pierce was a starter in year 1, but then lost his job last season.
Yeah.
Green wasn't a starter in either year, I don't think. Will Anderson will get banded around like that was part of the trade. That wasn't part of the trade. They
No, I know.
used one of our picks to trade up for Will Anderson, so that's deceptive. Tank Dell, yeah, looked like a stud last year until he broke his leg, but he's small, so whether he will last for a long time in the NFL remains to be seen. And then can't really judge any of the ones from this past draft either, can you? So
No.
I think people are going to overblow that because of who we traded for.
Yeah.
And everything that came with him. People are going to make the Texan side of that deal sound much better. But in
And I
fact,
think that CJ Stroud also, I think that he paints everything in a much lighter light, doesn't he?
exactly,
The fact
and
that
that's one of the biggest things of that trade was, although no part of what we did got them CJ Stroud, the fact that they didn't have Watson and had to get Stroud is probably the best thing to have happened to them from that trade. So where like it wasn't directly linked to any of our picks, but the fact that they needed a
but it would
QB and then
always feel like it is.
stumbled upon CJ Stroud, that would have, that's set them up for the next 10, 15 years if he's anywhere near as good as he was last year going forward. So
Yeah, I think that you can get a lot of Texans bandwagoning for the next couple of years. In any case, I mean, obviously, a few of these names are definitely part of that. But that's why I said as well, there's risk on both sides. It's a trade that, it's fun to look at this point because, you look at it and you can finally see as to what the numbers mean in terms of what we gave up. It was all like, oh God, that's a lot of potential that we've given up. Whereas you can see as to what it is now. It will be fun to look back on in 5 years' time. Hopefully, as Sean points out, it's whilst we've got our replica Lombardi rings, and looking out with rose tinted glasses. But it's just, definitely understand that point as well. There's a couple of names on that of which you look at and you go, it's not a complete it's not a complete whitewash. So it will be interesting going forward.
I think the other thing on that as well, mate, he probably just highlights how difficult it is getting the draft right. And fundamentally, I've never been a huge advocate in terms of trading picks away and getting more picks and all the rest of it, but you're just fundamentally buying chances. That's all you're doing. You're just giving yourself more chances to get it right. And you look at some of the selections in this year's draft, and the one that obviously springs off the page is the Atlanta pick of the quarterback in the first round, and that's a real head scratcher. You think, well, hang on a minute, you've just invested in Kirk Cousins, you've got the 8th pick, which is a premier pick, you've got the sort of second or third sort of wide receiver on the board, you've got other players that you could take. Why on earth would you do that? But that's why it's so difficult to predict any of this in terms of what you might have done, who might have been picked where. If the Browns had had those picks, it could have been a totally different order, totally different board, etc., etc. So it is such a real difficult exercise to go back and retrospectively look at it. But I think, like I said, the overall sort of consensus from this draft, you can tell, teams are desperate to get a quarterback and get a good one, and teams will invest anything. There 6 quarterbacks in the first, what was it, 12 picks or something. And correct me if I'm wrong, I haven't really heard a great deal about a lot of them. Do you know what I mean? It's not like I'm sort of thinking, oh, these are all going to be franchise-altering players. You know, Caleb Williams has been talked about a lot because he obviously was in the contention for #1 overall. But to be honest, Jaden Daniels, couldn't really tell you a lot about him. Drake May, the same. And it's like,
My
I'm
God.
looking at all. Yeah, I know, but you know where I'm coming from. You look at all of these guys, and it's like, some years you sort of, I think back to the year that sort of Burrow come out and Herbert come out and everything, and these were all talked about as real difference. None of these guys in the pre-draft cycle. I mean, Penix, by all accounts, a lot of people have got like 3rd and 4th round grade on him. He goes, 8th overall pick. It just shows the desperation at that position, and I think that's the thing that you look back at that trade that we made. It is desperation to try and get the position right. Then there's no two ways about it. It'll be everything else that surrounds it in terms of what Houston did, what we did, etc. It will fundamentally come down to, did that position and that player work out? So it'll be as simple as that in 2 years' time.
Do you know what? As you were talking about the rush for QBs, I've just looked at the board, and the discrepancy between pick 12, where Bo Nix was taken by the Denver Broncos, to the next picked quarterback is staggering. I don't think there's been that much of a gap in a long time. Unless I'm wrong, and I'm scrolling through this to make sure that I'm not.
It's Spencer Rattler, isn't it? Like 150 or something. Spencer Rattler.
Yeah, Spencer Rattler, 150.
Yeah.
I think it may have been, that one may have been close to the Kenny Pickett draft, because Kenny Pickett went like something like 22, and then the next one was in like the 5th round, I want to say.
Oh, really? Well,
yeah.
Fair enough. It must have just felt different because it was spaced out more in the first round, whereas this was a race. This was a real race to get into that QB market.
I think what's interesting about the Knicks Rattler thing is that a lot, like a decent chunk of people had them really close to each other. And the thing that's interesting about that, it was like the 6 spots that needed a QB in the worst way went, and then everyone was like, oh, we don't need a QB. So that's why he slipped all the way down to wherever he fell to. So I was quite surprised that Giants didn't take a stab at him, to be honest, because I think they need to sort
that was the
out.
first shock. The first shock was the Giants, wasn't it? And then the Falcons decided to come in with Penix. And then it kind of went back to being standard. The rest of the draft the rest of the first round seemed quite normal from what I can tell there. Was there anybody, Owain, that you feel from a team perspective that was, I was going to say shocking, but obviously we've picked up the Falcons as probably the one that's probably been the most shocking there. But any of which sort of caught your eye for any particular reason, like did remarkably well, or just interesting?
I think it's tough to say remarkably well. Obviously, but I was gutted that my favorite QB, Drake May, went to the Patriots, because I think he's in a really shitty situation. Like, he's got hardly anyone to throw to. His offensive line's not great. The team itself is just in a bad way. So I think he's gone to a pretty bad situation there. To be honest, I'm quite stunned that Washington didn't take him, because to me, I thought there was a clear gap between him and Jaden Daniels, and for them to put all their eggs in Jaden Daniels, who had one good season. You go back to the year before Jaden Daniels' his last season in college. He was playing for Arizona State, I believe, and like his teammates at Arizona were like lambasting him for being terrible.
Yeah.
And then he had one good season at LSU, obviously wins the Heisman, and then he's 2nd overall pick. So I was really surprised.
Heisman's one of the best adverts in football.
Mad. Really mad. And I was really, really surprised that they didn't take Drake May at 2. And I think they may live to regret that one. But the only other one that you could see as being, the Chiefs getting Xavier Worthy is going to be so interesting, because if he can be anywhere near as effective as Tyreek Hill was. Obviously, they're different players in terms of Tyreek Hill's stop and start is just unbelievable. But in terms of pure speed, Xavier Worthy he's obviously the fastest player ever to enter the league. So if that works out how some people think it's going to work out, that's going to be a frightening prospect for the AFC and the NFL as a whole.
Yeah, doubly interesting that Buffalo decided to assist as well.
Mm-hmm.
You'd think if there was one team that really wouldn't help Kansas get a wide receiver of real note, it would be them. So that will be interesting going forward.
And they took the wide receiver that I was really keen for the Browns to avoid a few picks after. So
Keon Coleman.
Keon Coleman. I was really desperate for the Browns not to be interested in Keon Coleman. So very happy when the Buffalo Bills took him off 20 odd picks before we picked.
Yeah, there was quite a rush for wide receivers as well, which I think was quite well documented. Could happen before them, because you saw the Chargers nipping in before the Patriots. Making a deal with the Patriots so they didn't go for Lad McConkey as well, who I think was talked about quite a lot in Brown circles, wasn't going to get down anywhere near us in the end. Interesting as to the way strategies go, but as we've talked about quite a lot today, a lot of offensive players off the board early. In fact, when was the first defensive player even taken up? 15. Wow. Yeah, wow.
Latu.
Yeah, wow. My God. And that started a small run of line. Wow, interesting. Right, we will be back, say a couple of weeks, maybe a bit more. There might be schedule stuff to talk about by then, chaps. That usually comes out around the 10th of May. 10ish of May. So that will probably be when we next reconvene. Thank you everyone for listening to tonight's show. For more in-depth draft analysis for things non-Browns, we recommend going to your other NFL podcast providers. But keep it with us for all things Browns, and we will see you in a couple of weeks. You've been listening to the Believe in Brits podcast.